So I know Gary's here, Gary Carrington. Catherine Goff is here. Catherine O is here. Karen is here. Elizabeth Harris. Jennifer Jackson, is that the Jen? I think so. Riaja Johnson from Wright State. Me, Michael Rani. Mary Lewis. Rosemary Shaw. Virginia Clark.
Hello.
Who am I missing? Anybody?
Peg.
Peg Mosier.
Hi, Peg. Good morning.
Morning.
You sound in fine voice this morning, Peg.
Yes, I am. I'm ready to sing.
Awesome.
Are you kicking the assembly off with a song?
And some pumping.
The answer is no. No, we will not be kicking off our first virtual assembly with a song by Dr. Mosier.
Don't make me laugh.
Oh, we like to have fun here at OPA. So how many of our folks do we have? Let me see here.
I don't know if Virginia, if you want to try your sound, see if we can hear you.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Good morning. Yes.
Morning.
Great. It looks like Jen stepped away to get coffee, so we can try her later.
Yeah. We'll just wait a couple more minutes.
Just 4 after 10, I would say, yeah, a couple more minutes.
Yeah, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And for those of you who are online and tweeting this morning, we just at the last minute made a hashtag OPA Assembly 17 is what I called it. I added the 17 at the end. I don't know if that'll be helpful, but if you tweet, feel free to tweet out as we're talking today, or if you're on Instagram or any other social media, feel free to share things and tag OPA in those. It's at ohpsych. Well, I think it's just at ohpsych on Twitter. Psych ASSN. Psych ASSN is the Twitter handle. So, Rosemary, don't tweet. You're driving.
That's right, I won't. I'll primarily be passive here.
Yeah.
It's quite gray out here, too.
We see you.
Hey, Angela.
I don't know if you can hear us, but we see you, Angela Miller.
Oh, good morning, Angela. I don't know if she can hear us either.
Oh,
there we go.
And has anyone else called in?
This is Mark.
Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Mark.
Morning.
Oh, there's my cat, Giovanni. I'm going to be doing the backgrounder for a few minutes, and if he doesn't meow and cry and ask for attention, it'll be a miracle. So.
Oh, that's okay. He's fairly good. And Jen's back. All right, well, I'll go ahead. I know we may get a couple of folks calling in late. That's fine. But in respect for everybody's Saturday morning, I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Mary Lewis, president of OPA, and I am so happy to welcome all of you to the very first virtual assembly of our new governance model. And I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to kind of remind us of how we got here. Many years ago, we started a process of looking at the governance structure for the Ohio Psych Association to try and make it a more nimble and effective and efficient organization. And through a lot of work by Dr. Kathy Ashton and Dr. Catherine O, we moved to this smaller governance board, but with a twice yearly assembly open to all the general members, so that we can talk and hear kind of at a grassroots level what's going on with psychologists and what's important to you. So the idea is that the principles will really support this idea of leadership and communication, transparency, but also use of technology. So this is our first big use of our Zoom technology. Good morning, Sandy. I see you.
Good morning. Good morning.
So what I thought we'd do, we've got most everybody online. There is a chat box down below, so if you have tech issues, just feel free to drop us a little note. I'll see that here at the main office with Michael. So I just, again, want to welcome all of you for being willing to be here this morning, but also being willing to try out this new model and just see how it goes. And then to encourage you, so we will have an assembly 2 days at convention in the spring. That's in April, correct?
Right, yeah.
So if you feel like today went well, but you want to do an in-person portion, just feel free to come to that. That'll be in Columbus in April of next year. So with that, I'm going to hand off the topic to Catherine.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. So what we're going to do next, if you have your agenda, is I'm going to talk for hopefully just 10 minutes. Could go to 15. We'll see how I do with time. To give some background information. And after that, we're really going to discuss those questions and get a sense of what we really think we should be doing, both for the public and for psychologists around this issue. And then hopefully end with some action steps, both for our OPA board to look at and also for our members in general. What can we be doing? And then I'll take a few minutes at the end to get feedback. This really is our first official assembly with the new governance model. And so we don't know how it's going to go. It's an experiment. And so welcome to our first assembly. And we're going to see how it goes today. And we're really interested in your feedback on how we can make this successful every fall as we do a virtual assembly like this. What can we do to make it better? There's my cat wanting attention, Giovanni. You're probably going to hear him in the next 10 minutes. So just to get started, I wanted to really thank Elizabeth Harris, who's on the call this morning, for submitting this topic. We had several compelling topics submitted, but both the timeliness and the persistence of this issue over the past few years led us to select this one for discussion today. So Elizabeth, you're going to get a gift card for a restaurant from Tom Swales, who sponsored that to encourage participation. So thank you for that topic.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So the discussion topic this morning is how can psychologists help victims of and witnesses to gun violence? We're not going to focus on prevention, as tempting as that is, or talk about gun regulation, but really look at recovery. And we want to know what can we do to help those who've experienced negative outcomes and what scientific evidence supports our efforts. As we talk about the background information and discuss the questions, I want us to think about how to address the effects of gun violence at multiple levels. So at the individual level, family, neighborhood, discipline-wide in the field of psychology, statewide in terms of policies and resources. And we can also think about it through the lenses of practice, science, education, communication, and advocacy. So keep your ear to those different valences as we go through today. So I also wanted to give a quick additional thank you here to our executive director, Michael Ranney. He did a fantastic job of reaching out to his contacts across the country to get expert resources for us to have this background information. So thanks, Michael.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So what do we know about the effects of shootings and gun violence on survivors and the families of victims, and how can we deal with these effects? We know it's typical for people to experience things like shock, sorrow, numbness, fear, anger, disillusionment, and grief. If we've worked with trauma survivors, we know they have trouble sleeping, concentrating, eating, and just remembering simple tasks. Those are common responses. And of course, those can interfere with school and work performances and affect relationships. We know that everybody has an immediate reaction to these kinds of trauma, but some folks develop longer-term stress reactions like PTSD or end up with depression, while others experience what we call resilience. Trauma reactions include PTSD symptoms like intrusive thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, avoiding triggers, and hyperarousal, looking over our shoulder, easily startled. And it also can impact our cognitive schemas and our relational attachment. So usually after a trauma, We may have a decreased sense of safety. We may have a hard time trusting others if it was another person who committed the violence. If we thought the world was safe before gun violence, we're likely to realize it's not afterwards. I wanted to tell a quick story. About 4 weeks ago, I was doing a 3-day workshop at the Gestalt Institute here, and one of the participants was a senior citizen, an African-American woman, and she lives in one of the low-income housing neighborhoods here in Cleveland. She missed the second day of the workshop, but then returned on the third day. And the workshop itself was designed to help us tell our stories in a way that connects us to other people and creates genuine community. So when she came back on Sunday, she told us her story of that Friday night. She had been upstairs at a friend's apartment, and they'd heard gunfire and called the police. And when she returned to her apartment on the first floor, there was a bullet hole through her window into her freezer and through the tray in the freezer where she keeps her food. She realized that if she'd been standing in her kitchen at that moment, she would have been killed. So even though those incidents happen a lot in her neighborhood, it had never happened to her before. She was shaky and traumatized all the next day, and when she came back to us on Sunday morning, she was still shaking when she told us her story. So these things, as we know, are happening all around us all the time, both urban gun violence, like the one I just described, and also gun violence in rural areas as well. So a few things that we know can help are the caring support of community, friends, and family, access to mental health care, immediately afterwards returning to routines, getting back to eating and sleeping, positive coping, some healthy avoidance of triggers and remembering it, and then talking about the experience as she did. Of course, we know trauma therapy and trauma-informed therapy can be helpful, and culturally adapted or culturally appropriate supports. So to go out to the community level now, what structures can help communities better deal with the effects of gun violence? We know that we need trauma-informed care. The backgrounder that you received mentioned health, mental health, education, social service programs. I also think first responders like police and possibly clergy and religious leaders can be informed about what is trauma-informed care. We need broad public education and also possibly targeted education to affected communities about what are the common reactions to trauma and what helps. And then what are some barriers to developing these structures? I think the context of the trauma and the culture of the people impacted is going to affect how the trauma is interpreted and what will be helpful. So as we know, some communities have long histories of trauma, and both first responders and mental health professionals can be viewed with suspicion or fear. There also may be limited access to health care and negative experiences with health providers who are not culturally sensitive. So for communities experiencing poverty and racism, recovery may look different. It may be more community-based or culturally specific. As I was preparing for this morning's assembly, I reread Jamaica Falconer's blog on the Ferguson experience. She had gone into the community before Michael Brown's shooting and had met with groups to discuss the relevance of hip-hop music lyrics, conducting what she called hip-hop therapy with the youth there. So as she talked about how to deal with the effects of the shooting in Ferguson, she recommended addressing racism, sexism, and classism in our work as therapists, educators, and advocates, and being creative and coming up with culturally relevant interventions. She also mentioned engaging community leaders like clergy and other spiritual leaders. We need to engage school personnel, health professionals, and caregivers so everybody can understand the problems faced and the ways in which the community can handle them. In these instances, particularly a focus on family and community environments is important. If we can strengthen the community that's going to do most of the responding and care, they're going to have a better chance at helping people recover from trauma. So a couple of things that might be helpful are early intervention with at-risk families that improve parenting skills, a comprehensive approach to taking advantage of training and skills of law enforcement, educators, and mental health providers, and addressing issues of poverty, racism, and sexism at a community, city, or statewide level. So basically, we want to shore up and strengthen the communities that provide the immediate and long-term care for individuals affected by gun violence. All of those interventions should be culturally and developmentally appropriate. So the last thing I want to talk about is, I guess, two more things. Science is one, and secondary traumatic stress is another. So we saw in the backgrounder that there's actually an issue with the science around gun violence. Both the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institutes of Health are limited. We have current state and federal restrictions that discourage firearm violence research. So it's difficult to do research on firearm violence and the effects of that. So there may be some policy changes that we can advocate for in that regard, so we can specifically address these issues in our science and research. And then my last point is about secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. So even though a person may not be directly impacted by the violence or directly see the violence, if they're helping someone who was impacted by it, they can be affected. So as you know, from working with folks who have trauma, if you're listening to someone's detailed story of their traumatic experience, it has an impact on you, especially if you're doing a good job and really empathizing and following them emotionally with what they're experiencing. So we also can have disruptions, get burned out more easily, have concerns about our safety, or start to feel helpless or hopeless with our clients. So secondary traumatic stress is something we need to think about, both with the communities helping each other and with mental health professionals who are working with trauma survivors. So that is the end of my background information. I just wanted to review what you had to get us started and help us be grounded in the research and the knowledge that we already have as we go into our discussion. So if you have your agenda at the end of the backgrounder, you'll see the next portion is going to be a nice lengthy discussion, 45 minutes between all of us, discussing questions 1 through 3, so that we can look at the individual, systems level, and cultural implications of gun violence. And then the last 20 minutes will be really looking at what are the action steps, both for OPA, for the board, and suggestions for OPA members in Ohio. So let's look at the first question. I'm going to stop talking as much and really listen. And feel free to just jump in there, of course, try not to talk over each other. But I'm not going to talk as much in these parts and just really open up the dialogue to all of you. So if you look at the first discussion question, what we want to think about first is our own role as mental health care providers. So how can we improve our response and other mental health care providers' response to victims and witnesses of gun violence? I'm interested to hear some of your thoughts.
This is Kathy, and I think that it would be really helpful during any kind of workshop for the presenter to be informed and kind of effective with trauma-informed care, so that things can be presented in that nature and talked about in that nature, no matter what the topic is, because I think it's all around us, and I think that, you know, people get triggered unintentionally by very simple things that we may or may not say or do or pick up on.
I 100% agree with you, Kathy. This is Elizabeth speaking. I think that having a cultural understanding is really important for the providers of individuals who have gone through some sort of traumatic stress. I think it's important for them to understand what is traumatic for their patients and what isn't. It could be, you know, some experiences that they may react to that the provider may view as being traumatic, but the individual doesn't. So it's really important for, I think, the provider to be familiar with the environment that that person lives in, or that situation that that person has been in, and to get an understanding of what is traumatic to them versus what is not, and then structuring their interventions appropriately.
Yeah, this is Mark.
Yes,
Can you
Mark.
hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking at a basic level, this kind of sounds simplistic, but I think we just need to listen. You know, I was doing a bariatric evaluation a few years ago, and the woman came in and told me how one of her sons, a 15-year-old, had gotten a gun and accidentally shot the 18-year-old. So she's dealing with, you know, a son who's dead and a son going to prison. So, you know, I think the best I could do, at least in the beginning, is just listen. You know, listen and try to understand what it's like for her. And so I think that's where it starts for me at the basic level.
Thank you.
This is, I'm sorry, was I talking over someone?
No, go ahead.
Okay. This is Angela. One of the things that I was thinking about is kind of recognizing that if, you know, our own needs for self-care and our own responses to kind of the inherent horrors of gun violence, and particularly if we are members of the community, whether we're talking geographic or cultural or whatever, that was the target of the violence, that we are kind of consistently and intentionally demonstrating or practicing awareness and self-evaluation of where we are with that. And obviously, if we need assistance, kind of modeling that for the people that we work with. But I think as we've seen an increase in not just isolated events of gun violence, but mass shootings and just kind of being aware of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
This is Peg. I just wanted to kind of add a slightly different perspective. I work almost exclusively with trauma survivors. And what I have found, given all of the violence, gun violence and other violence going on, not only in this country, but across the world, that I have learned that it's important for me after every one of these incidents to just at least ask my clients how they're doing, whether they're having any reactions, and if so, you know, not to get caught up in whatever we are currently working on, but to make sure that there is room for us to talk about whatever reactions that they may have. I find that even though someone may not have a direct relationship with a gun violence situation, often they are triggered.
That's a good point, Peg. I wonder, as we're talking about mental health, you know, responses to victims and witnesses, I mean, not only the lack of research on just you know, on specific to gun violence, we have a lot of research on how to respond to trauma, but I wonder if there's any room for preventative care, like making connections with communities, because I think the challenge, and I know there's a question later on about culture, but I think one of my challenges, for example, at Columbus State, where I work, we are an inner city, high diversity, racial diversity, and religious diversity school. And these students come from really trauma background. I mean, they come from homelessness and poverty and gun violence. And one of the challenges is when something happens and then we respond after the fact, the typical response I get for a lot of students is, unless they have felt like the professor or a staff member at the college has cared ahead of time, they don't want to hear it. They don't want a white savior coming in and rescuing them, because we weren't there to begin with. And so what I want to know is, how do we as mental health providers build trust and rapport and proactively engage with communities at risk so that it doesn't become, oh, here come the psychologists after the fact to save us, but more of they've always been here, they've always supported us. And so this, I mean, this is a bigger question to just violence in general, but I just see like if we can help teach mental health providers prevention and how to engage with communities at risk as opposed to what to do after, maybe that would help. But I don't know exactly how we do that successfully.
I agree with you, Mary. This is Elizabeth. I think that sometimes it's just a matter of going back to our basic skills when it comes to building rapport, especially when it comes to the African American community and maybe some other people of color. Sometimes, like Mark said, it's just a matter of listening and those individuals feeling like they're being heard and that there are actions to follow. So when I made the statement about referring back to our basic skills, sometimes there are some practitioners, so I've heard, that leave out the summary and reflection part of therapy. So they go straight to, oh, I got to do something about this. And they think of all the solutions and things that they can do for the patient, or they'll try and think of ways that the patient can fix the problem rather than trying to understand it first. So something as simple as trying to understand what you thought you heard can be really powerful in terms of building rapport.
That's a wonderful thing, Elizabeth. And I do think that's true in a lot of contexts, this idea that we have to kind of fix things right away as opposed to just sitting with the feelings and processing that and reflecting that. So that's wonderful. Jen has a question that she typed in the chat box. I want to read for her. How should we respond to those who assume or ask why we didn't see it coming after gun violence happens? I've seen and heard everywhere saying we should have known the person who did the shooting was going to and somehow prevented that. So that's a good question.
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
That's a tough one. To deal with that a little bit, not to this extreme in terms of gun violence, but at Cleveland State University, where I'm the counseling center director, I serve on a committee where our job is every week to meet and look at folks who are struggling and try to prevent them from getting in crisis. Or if they're in crisis, try to give them resources, help them be okay, partly to prevent their own crises, but also to help prevent violence against others on campus. And sometimes we get somebody at the point where we can prevent the violence, maybe before they're even thinking about hurting other people, or maybe we get to them after they've already posted something on Facebook that was alarming, like I'm going to bomb financial aid or something, and then we intervene and provide resources at that point. But the truth is, in terms of the laws, we're legally prohibited from taking direct action and imprisoning someone, either in a prison or a psychiatric unit, until they're at the point where they really are going to immediately harm someone else or themselves. So it's very difficult to intervene when someone's in the stages of starting to, get more and more in crisis, unless they're willing to receive help. So one of the things I struggle with around that is that we're always trying to balance autonomy of individuals versus safety of the community. And we can't just lock everyone up who's struggling because they could become dangerous in the future.
Yeah, this is Virginia. I was thinking also that maybe just pointing out that it's natural after one of these incidents, to these tragedies, to think, well, how could we have prevented it? That's what people go through when they go through something traumatic. That they try to, it's a way of dealing with the trauma, and maybe just even pointing that out. But there's this balance, like you pointed out, between people's rights and
the safety of the community.
Mhm.
This is Rosemary. I was thinking a little differently. I guess based on a case I had recently where the young man that was involved in the shooting, supposedly is framed in this gang shooting. The mother came to me for therapy, and it was actually the youngest daughter in that family that was having the toughest time, that nobody was paying attention to it. And it was only because I was trying to get the mother to tell me more about the impact on the family, like they had to move out of the community and so forth, that I really started to think about that. So along the line of prevention and also responding to do more work with understanding the impact on the greater family, not just the immediate, but the greater family, and then doing follow-up with them.
Mhm.
So whether they were the victim or the perpetrator.
I agree, Rosemary. I worked with a patient who was a victim of gun violence. Actually, two patients were in this scenario. And really interestingly, the person who took it the hardest with both these situations was an older brother. And there are times where I would have to have the session be with just the victim and the older brother, to talk about like what went on through their minds, like the fear of losing their loved one, and that loved one hearing them say that. And I think that just like that person hearing how it affected their family members really helped them in terms of healing. It helped them in terms of making sense of what happened and getting through it and being resilient. So I would agree that like paying attention to the reactions of the family members and making sure that that reaction is something that is actually helpful rather than, I guess, hurtful, is something that we have to work with too.
This is Michael.
And what I seem to be, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that NPR had a program this morning, it's probably being repeated now, where they were interviewing the sister of one of the Sandy Hook kids who was killed. And she was saying that every time there was one of these gun violent events, that she relived the whole experience and all the emotions she felt when her sister was killed. And I think it's important to be sensitive to the fact that anybody who's gone through this kind of experience is going to have that sort of return of all the emotions every time we have one of these gun violent events.
And this is
Right, I heard
Kathy.
that too this morning. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say the re-traumatizing is what they were emphasizing.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm struck with how that over and over again, as each of us are saying things, it's that helpless, hopeless piece that we almost have to normalize instead of making it seem like, so we slow down and listen, or we slow down and not jump to conclusions like grab a gun and go take revenge, or so it's, if there are ways that we can even in a broader way help people in general kind of stop and breathe and say, oh my God, I feel completely helpless right now. And for that to be okay, and for them to understand that it's part of the process, it's not something to cover over or rush through or.
Kathy, that brings up a question for me. So I'm mid-career, And in my graduate training program, we didn't talk about trauma-informed care. There wasn't such a thing. We talked about working with trauma victims. We talked about empathy. We talked about compassion. But I have been, in the last couple of years, teaching SAMHSA's trauma-informed approach to my nursing students, because I think medical environments are where people experience a lot of re-trauma. You know, for example, sexual assault victim may go in for a routine OB exam and feel re-traumatized. And so I wonder, like if we're talking about providers and educating providers, we have this age differential. We have a lot of very young psychologists and early career folks, and we have a lot of older psychologists who may not even be aware that there are trauma-informed models and may just feel like, oh, well, if I'm just empathic enough, that's enough. And I just wonder if, you know, if I go back to the question of how do we improve providers' responses, does it make sense? Like, should we be more, as an organization or as a profession, more proactively teaching people trauma-informed care models and trauma-informed therapy specifically? And I'm just throwing this out as a, you know, because I only learned about SAMHSA's model a couple of years ago. And I just don't know, like, if I'm a practitioner and I've been out there for 30 or 40 years and I work with a specific patient population and that's not been part of my continuing education, where would I have learned that from?
Yeah, I think that's a really important way that OPA could contribute, is making sure that we have more aspects of trauma-informed care in our educational presentations.
Hi, this is Virginia. You know, I recently have a case where I was seeing a client regarding marital distress and decision she was trying to make, and suddenly I'm treating somebody who's experienced having been threatened with a gun by her husband. And so, you know, even though someone might not be trained, you know, that I don't have a lot of background in PTSD and trauma work, but it's almost like we need a workshop that's, you know, trauma-informed care for, you know, the non-expert, you know, for people that, you know, don't necessarily want to work with these populations all the time, but people experience traumatic experiences all the time, you know, and it just comes up. And so, you know, my way of dealing with it is I talked to Angela, who I knew had background, and, you know, I got some tips on, I wanted to see if I could prevent her from developing PTSD if possible. But, you know, so that was how I informed my care. But, you know, maybe not everyone would do that.
I think that's a really great point, that trauma is so pervasive that you don't have to be going in as a trauma therapist to have clients who have trauma either in their background or while you're in therapy with them. You may have been working with them for a while on something else, and then they experience a trauma, like you're saying, and you're the one they've already got rapport with. So it makes sense for you to be responding to that as a therapist. Mm-hmm.
And I think because trauma is so pervasive, clients often don't identify that they have experienced trauma. This is what always happens in my family, in my neighborhood, for generations, in my country.
Right.
It's just same old, same old.
So we just have about 2 more minutes left on this question. We've had some great discussion here. Were there any points that came up for you that you didn't voice yet? I want to make room for additional responses here.
Yeah, I have a comment. I think it's really important for providers to make sure that they're checking their own biases when they're listening to the scenarios that have happened. Sometimes when they're working with individuals who have been through some sort of gun violence or trauma, then all of a sudden certain stereotypes may come about. Like,
Yeah.
oh, you must be someone who lives in a bad neighborhood, or, you know, you must be a low income individual, and these may not necessarily be the cases. So it's important to make sure that you're not reacting to stereotypes as opposed to actually understanding what the situation really is.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful point, Elizabeth. Thank you for reminding us of that, because I do think sometimes it's important, you know, just kind of to check at every point, like, what am I thinking and how am I processing this?
Yeah, I think one of the things that came up for me that I didn't voice yet is the idea that if someone's telling me a story that I would be traumatized by what happened, I may have my own reaction that's quite different from theirs. So I need to check my own reaction and be careful about what are my feelings versus what are the client's feelings. So I can manage my own feelings, you know, after session, talking with a colleague, and I need to be aware of following the client more, as you were kind of saying, Elizabeth, to not presume that this should be creating the response I'm having. They should be having this response too. Not necessarily. So kind of really, I think trauma therapy requires a lot of managing of self in the session so that we can be fully present for our clients.
Elizabeth, this is Sandy. This brought up, what you said brought up for me also. I've been sitting here listening about the part about stereotyping in particular, and just thinking about the gap that probably exists between most therapists and people that land up in neighborhoods where these things may happen more frequently, and just the general attitudes that we might carry about guns, gun owners, people who are around guns, people who live in communities where guns are more frequent. I think I just wonder what the implications are for the kind of the gap that at least I believe exists for many helpers in those situations.
You know, and that's a really important point, Sandy. We had a similar conversation at one of the retreats at in our department of psychiatry at UH, and I went out on a limb and made a suggestion because there was a lot of thoughts and ideas thrown out about secondary stress and vicarious trauma. And one of the things that I suggested was, you know, why don't we look at this in terms of, you know, providing therapy for ourselves in the process of providing therapy for others. For example, you know, expose ourselves to what actually goes on and what are the things you should react to versus the things that you shouldn't. Of course, as you might probably suspect, nobody liked the idea of going into the environment just, you know, for, you know, observation's sake to see what it is that's really happening. And I thought that was unfortunate because it's like, well, I just want to hear what you have to say and then feel bad for you, but I don't really want to see how it feels. I don't really want to, you know, fill in the gap. I want to keep that space in between you and me. And that's what I think we need to work on too, is to make sure that we're here with them as opposed to for them.
That's a really good point.
That was really good, Elizabeth.
You did that way better than I did. That was exactly what I was talking about, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, what a rich discussion. Thank you, everybody, for that first question discussion. Let's move to the second level then. It feels like we've been stretching a bit toward this in some of our responses. So the second question to discuss is what systems level interventions might be helpful. So at the community or neighborhood level, in healthcare, in training or continuing ed, in legal or policy changes, what kinds of things do we think could be helpful in this regard?
This is Virginia. A little while back, I was involved in a disaster team organization. I think it was initially through the church that I was going to at the time, but it was community-wide. But it was a network of people, professionals that, not mental health professionals not necessarily, but just professionals who were informed regarding disaster relief. I kind of wonder if, I mean, it may already exist something like this, but you know, to have a network of mental health professionals who can respond, because I think, you know, sometimes, you know, like I've gotten a call before from a business where there was a shooting and they wanted someone to come that day, you know, to, you know, help talk over with the employees there. And, you know, the way my schedule set up, you know, I'm full at that time, you know, and nobody else was available. But, you know, it might be nice if we had a network of people that people could call, you know, that almost like they're on call, or, you know, I don't know. I don't know how it would work, but just having a network that's trained, people who are trained in dealing with trauma initially.
There is a Red Cross disaster mental health network. I think they get mobilized for mass disasters and natural disasters, things like that. Is anybody more familiar with that?
Yeah, APA kind of coordinates that, and they work with the Red Cross. We have a disaster response coordinator who's sort of hooked into that national network, and every time there's a hurricane or a flood or anything like that, they mobilize the network and bring people in to help in the situation. Certainly with all the hurricanes lately, they've been keeping pretty busy, and probably still our psychologists in Puerto Rico now helping people there cope with the stress of recovering from that terrible hurricane.
I think one thing we should, you know, to think about, and we do a lot of networking. So Michael's a member of the health, the Network of Healthy
Coalition for Healthy Communities.
And there are some other resources. So a couple of months ago, I went to the MAC conference up the street. That's the multicultural multi-ethnic advocates for cultural competency. I'll get it here. But I went to a workshop on building community relationships. And there was a presenter there from the Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition, Yvonne. And what she was talking about is that it's, again, like, it's a systemic, proactive, comprehensive model. It's, you know, so what she talked about is when she's started to do this work, she would sit in meetings and people would say, well, it's a African-American community, so let's go to the church that's in the middle of that neighborhood. And so what they were doing in these kind of helping communities is, she's a social worker, they were feeding off the stereotype that the Black church is the home for everybody in the neighborhood, and they would go there and just assume that they could connect with the community there. And the story she was telling was that this was a young group of people, and they didn't want to come to a health fair at a church. They wanted to have a basketball tournament, and none of them went to church. Like, they didn't have that connection.
Yeah.
And the older people I love this story because she's like, all of the people in the room were insisting they have a health fair in the church. And the young people stood up and walked out because they said, you are not hearing us. We don't want to come pick up a brochure. We don't want to sit down and get our blood pressure taken. We want to go do something we enjoy. And then if you're part of that, and if we trust you, then sit down and tell us what's going on. So her conversation with us in the room was really profound because she was trying to do what we're talking about, which was engage multiple, what's the word I'm looking for? You're investing in something, multiple I forget, I don't know what word I'm searching for, but to not rely, again, like Liz has said, don't rely on a stereotype to get in the community, but to ask the community, like that's the issue with like service work, is we just assume we know what the community needs. But if we're going to say, you know, what system level intervention do we need? I think each community is so unique and needs to be asked what would be effective in this space. And then we bring the resources to them. So like Virginia, your question, like that would be great if we had a network of people and the community knew they could call us, and maybe they don't need a psychologist, but maybe they wanted a social worker, or maybe they needed a dietitian for something, or maybe they just wanted somebody who could do relaxation. You know, it would be them recognizing us as experts, and being trusting enough to reach out and explicitly say what they needed.
Hey, Mary, I want to jump in and kind of piggyback on that comment. I think that's a good example of how oftentimes that as psychologists, sometimes we may fall into that myth or stereotype. Certain groups, maybe even African Americans, are monolithic in nature in what they do, and even from a religious standpoint. You know, there are many backgrounds in terms of religious affiliation within the African American community, and a lot of individuals may not attend church. They may be of different religious backgrounds, and so I think it is important to determine in terms of what level in terms of intervening. And so I'd like to provide one example, a group that I affiliate with and have been working with, volunteering a lot of time, probably for the last 10 plus years, is a group called the 100 Black Men of America. And one of the focuses of the group is mentoring. Other focus is education, health and wellness, and a fourth focus would be economic empowerment. And really the group is geared around just trying to provide kind of different interventions, so to speak, more so from a community base in terms of getting out into the community and meeting and working with particular populations, in this case, especially African American male populations. And so one of the things that we were able to do is to go out directly into the schools. We were able to create a program that centered around, at the time, there were a lot of police shootings here in Cleveland and actually going on across the country, and still are in a lot of cases. And so we were just trying to determine how could we begin to be a bridge, or at least work with some of the young Black kids that were, you know, being impacted directly by some of the fallout or just overall trauma. And so we just put together a program after meeting with the principal of the school and some other school district leaders, and just determine what would be the most appropriate way to just meet with the kids, address some of the issues, and just frankly, just begin by having just some open dialogue about how they felt in relationship to interaction with the police in their community, what were issues that they were facing on a daily basis in their communities, in their home, and even in school, and whether it was a lack of feeling safe, even within the school setting. And a lot of it did center around gun violence and just violence as a whole. But in this case, how a lot of the Black boys especially felt like they were being targeted by the police, even in cases where it was not warranted. So I think figuring out what level to intervene is certainly one issue, but I think also just identifying what might be some of those underlying issues as well is important.
I want to piggyback off of what Gary was saying, and also mention that when it comes to mention about mass shootings, police brutality, I think the language is really important. one thing that I've observed, and I think a lot of people from the African American community has observed, is that the language changes when it is a person of color who is the assumed or the accused person who's causing the violence. For example, it may be referred to as a mass shooting in one scenario, but then in another scenario, it may be referred to as a domestic act of terrorism. And that really infuriates people when they realize that these are the exact same circumstances, yet with this person you refer to it as a mass shooting, with this person you refer to it as terrorism, because that brings forth a whole different set of implications. And I think that just like being careful about the language that we use to describe these incidents is important. Making sure that, you address people about, the terms, the aggressive terms that can be used when they talk about the incident, and see how they feel about these things is something that we need to address, not only with the people who are the victims of the event, but also with the people who are doing something about it, like politicians, people who are in the media talking about the incident. The way that they use their language affects the people who are watching or the people that were a part of it. And sometimes when they feel like things aren't described appropriately, they feel like they're not a part of it anymore. And that can be another way to re-experience trauma.
We've been talking a lot about community level responses here in terms of disaster response, the Coalition for Healthy Communities, Gary's intervention in the Cleveland schools. This language piece is a little different. It's more like advocating or maybe calling out politicians or media, maybe writing op-eds, more of an advocacy, broader approach. I wonder if there are also continuing education or training changes or legal or policy changes that we think might be helpful here.
I think if there's anything, and I don't think there's much that we can do right now, but anything that we can do to help change the censorship of research, so to change policies that have done that, I think that's where the answer is. We just don't have the data to move forward with whatever needs to be moved forward with.
Yeah, I think that's something we can ask APA about too. Where is that? Is it even in the pipeline for anyone to be addressing that? And how can we support that if it is being addressed?
Yeah, I think that's a real good point. That's a very good point.
One of the things that comes up for me as we're talking is a sense of how to be an ally if we're not a person of color. So as a white person, if I'm working with people of color who are experiencing these incidences of violence, or if I want to engage with a community of color, how do I come in as a white ally to these issues? So possibly some training that would help white psychologists who are interested in engaging communities to know how to do that well. Or maybe even strategies like partnering with other psychologists of color to assist. So maybe some strategies like training around how do we engage with communities to provide proactive support, and how do white psychologists, what are some strategies to be effective in allying with communities of color to provide this kind of support? How do we do that in a way that's not patronizing or re-traumatizing for people experiencing racism.
And I think even more than that, there are cultures of different cultures of gun ownership. So, for example, when I was working in Wisconsin, I was working at a state hospital with the most violent children in the state who couldn't be treated anywhere else. Well, not even rural, most of Wisconsin hunts. That's what they do. They come up with guns from a very early age, and so we had to really examine ourselves and speak with the families when they would say, you know, we're enrolling him in a hunter safety course. We're saying, here's a kid with violence problems and you're going to put a gun in his hands. But they were coming from a whole different perspective of, wait a minute, what are you saying?
Kathy, that's a really good point. I grew up in rural Kansas, and everybody owned a gun, and most of the time it was long guns because it was deer hunting and everything revolved around what hunting season it was.
Mm-hmm.
But it was interesting because we didn't have a lot of gun violence per se, because at the time, at least the community I lived in, there was a very strong push to every single child had to go through a gun safety class. And so it's like driving a car, right? A car can be a violent weapon, but we go through classes and we get a license. We
Right.
get how to use it appropriately. That doesn't eliminate people using cars to drive into crowds and whatnot, but it allows people to, you know, to more safely use it, or to it changes the way you see it.
Yes.
But I'm also wondering, just in your question, like, let's say, I don't know I know the restriction on gun research is at the federal level.
Yes.
But let's say, for example, OPA says this is really important to us. Could our foundation have a grant that a student could apply for to study the impact of gun violence in a community here in Ohio? Like, is that something that would be effective or would be helpful? Or would we be allowed to fund something like that? I don't know. Like, what if we even just studied the gun culture in Ohio, right?
Yeah,
I think we probably have to get educated on the power of the NRA, and, you know, I don't know that I'd want to put a student in that position.
Right.
Because I think that's, I mean, if they've got the government convinced not to do research, I don't know that I want to put anybody in a dangerous spot.
And I agree with just kind of really getting a better understanding of gun culture, because, you know, the question, or really the reaction to gun violence becomes, we need to look at gun laws. We need to look at whether civilians should have access to guns. And I always feel like that's the wrong approach. I don't think that really, I guess, becoming more strict on gun laws is the answer. Because what we're talking about is misuse of guns. When you look at places like New York and Chicago, where they have some of the highest gun violence, guns are restricted. You're not allowed to own or carry a gun in New York City or in Chicago, yet it's where the gun violence is the most pervasive. So obviously, if it's not working there, it probably won't work across the country. So that tells us that this gun violence isn't so much about what the allowances are. It has more to do with a public health issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when we look at policy changes, I think the policies should really focus toward addressing public health rather than focusing on restricting gun possession.
So I want to be careful. I'm tempted to respond and give my, gun restriction opinions. And I know we could all probably talk about that for the next hour. But I do like that we're talking about things other than restricting guns, because I know even if you're for restricting guns, that is a long journey politically in terms of changing policy. Whereas what we're focusing on in terms of recovery, it does feel like there are things we could do in the next 6 months, in the next year, to begin to help. Any other comments on this topic of systems level change before we go into talk more in detail about culture?
Yeah, Kathy, this is Gary. I wanted to just add, I think, too, we could take a look at what we could do more so on the state and local levels. Certainly being a OPA and what we could do in terms of providing training. I know we offer a number of trainings, whether it's through web-based or other, workshops. And so I know even with to tie it into our committee, the diversity committee, one of the things that we've been just bouncing around over the last year, what are some other topics that we could provide training? And again, not that this is just because it's certainly not an African American issue. I think it's a United States issue as a whole. So I want to be clear on that. It's not a Black issue. This is a whole societal issue here in the United States in terms of our gun culture as a whole. But what can we do to provide trainings and workshops as an organization? And I think the other way is through collaborations, whether it's with NAMI, the Alliance of Mental Illness, and certainly I've been doing a little bit of work too with Association of Black Psychologists. I know in the past they had a grant where they were working on with one of the city councilmen in Cleveland in terms of studying violence in one particular area. And so I think collaborations could be another strong systems level intervention in terms of that could be helpful.
And I apologize. I may be speaking to something that was addressed before. I actually had gotten accidentally locked out of my new office this morning. And so you were all talking in the background and I couldn't get in to talk to you. One of the things, piggybacking on Gary's ideas for webinars, and thinking about how we as psychologists engage communities and community members and identify needs, etc. When I was doing my master's in public health, some of the courses that we did and what we did with when we were working with a very diverse immigrant neighborhood was we really studied and employed a lot of community action research techniques. And that was really, although I was part of actually an acting white quantitative research project, qualitative research project at Kent State, the idea of the community action research wasn't something that was really modeled or discussed as part of my psychology degree program. And so I'm wondering if kind of using some of these resources from our public health counterparts and providing them to psychologists to say, here are some additional techniques where you can that you can use to strengthen your research and your research proposals or diversify your research proposals to better address some of these issues.
It's a good idea, Angela. Thank you for bringing that up.
Great. I want to make a process comment. One of the things I'm noticing, I don't know if it's accurate or not, excuse me, is that we're talking our leaders in OPA. Some of us are talking more than others. And so I just want to encourage those who haven't spoken as much to get your voice in there, say some of the things you're thinking. We definitely want to hear from everybody during the call. So in the last 45 minutes, if you haven't spoken as much, I just want to encourage you to speak more. And for those of us who've already spoken a bit, I'm encouraging us to sit back and listen more and make sure we get a really good, diverse, inclusive experience here. So it doesn't mean don't talk if you have been talking, but I want to hear from everybody too if possible. So the last question we want to discuss before we talk about action steps is, how does culture influence our interventions? And how can we create culturally appropriate responses, both at the individual psychotherapy level and also at the larger systems level as we start to look at creating public education, changing policy, things like this.
I want to kind of add a kind of a broader piece to this that I'm wondering about. Is I'm wondering for the people on this call, what do we think our roles are in this situation? You know, when we talk about these issues, whether it's gun violence or other things, what, you know, I'm struck by up until the very last part of this call, we were still talking around fairly traditional forms of intervention. And when you added the action research component, that got my mind triggered again to what if we were using in the mental health area a fuller range of interventions more routinely than we have, a different balance of interventions about how to design interventions or how to figure those things out, rather than and in this discussion we're going to be looking at, well, if we're doing therapy with people that have been traumatized by gunshot violence, how do we force fit their needs into the model that we have now? And I'm just wondering, is there another way or other methods we should be incorporating to try to figure out how to do this outreach and full community engagement?
I'm reminded of a client I had a few years ago who came in and he had just aged out of foster care, and he had had a fantastic therapy experience in foster care with his therapist who played basketball with him every week. That was their therapy session. And I was sad to tell him he probably wasn't going to get that as an adult, because it does seem like that would have been a more appropriate form of intervention for him. It was outside of our policies and procedures, right? So how do we challenge those notions that we've built our whole ethics and policies and procedures around in order to create more appropriate and helpful interventions?
Yeah, I think that's been the struggle of a number of kinds of therapies that seem to be, I'm putting quotes around this, not empirically supported play therapy approaches, which actually are, I see plenty of adults in my office who also pick things up and use them during sessions. Or more experiential kinds of therapies that I think really do reach people on a different level when they need that. And maybe that is something that we could be encouraging or supporting groups that are already doing that kind of research.
This is Rosemary. Of course, I'm always in support of the concept of integrative medicine. And I don't mean just coming together as a group of professionals and talking, but actually working hand in hand with, we all have to stay within our scope of practice, but how can we really team up to work together? Some of you work in big hospitals and you have that, but for those that aren't in big hospitals, you're often working in isolation. And, you know, something I'm always doing is trying to reach out across, like you said, some of the non-traditional, some of the more holistic approaches, but not just in I'm treating you, but in like Sandy, what you're talking about is really thinking about fully engaging community effort toward whatever it is that we're dealing with, particularly when there's violence in a community, to really bring the physicians in. You know, the physicians are really moving right now, even in this area of integrative medicine. My son just came from a conference. It was a Northeast conference, and a family medicine physicians, and they had a whole integrative medicine component. And, you know, I think if we as psychologists bring our skill set to the table and really begin to work hand in hand with others as they also try to work more integratively, then we can treat that whole person, not just theoretically, but really, you know, from the beginning stages that they walk in our door to what else can we get them engaged in. So anyway, I can go on and on about integrative medicine, but I think we as psychologists, as OPA, need to keep revisiting how can we really take our skill sets. I mean, we are behaviorists. You know, when I work at the hospital and I work in sleep medicine, I'm always talking to people, to our sleep docs that just want to give meds. You know, I can talk to somebody for 45 minutes. You've got them for 5 to 10 minutes. What can we do together with what you bring to the table and what I can do in terms of really impacting the family, behavior, a lifestyle, and so forth?
This is Elizabeth, and forgive me for not recalling this person's name, but we spoke, and I don't know, Gary, if you can help me out. We spoke with someone who is a part of the Ohio Congress, the lady who spoke at the diversity meeting in the morning.
Senator Chavez.
Tavares.
It was Tavares. Yes,
Yeah,
Senator
Tavares.
Tavares. And one of her efforts is to push for cultural competence among physicians as part of their continuing education, which I thought was wonderful. And one point that she made was that the physicians felt like they didn't need it, like they already knew, and they already knew how to be culturally competent without having it as part of you know, one of their requirements to continue their license. And so I know that this is one thing that she's working on. I know that many of us that were in the room that morning supported that effort. And I'd be interested in following up to see where that's gone. I think that's one way that we can approach what I think you're saying, Rosemary.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't gone anywhere, to answer your question.
Okay.
It's probably not going to, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The Medical Association is a powerful lobby, and actually most of the provider associations, it didn't just affect physicians, it affected all providers, including psychologists, and we already have some recognition of the importance of cultural competency training in our revised licensure law, but just about everybody else was opposed to it, and really it boiled down to the fact that they don't like to be told what to do.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Michael.
You know, I think it's an interesting point, though, because physicians are saying we don't want to be told what to do, but there's been a lot of research and media attention on patient non-compliance lately, and how doctors want to get patients to complain. So I think the irony that they don't want to be told what to do, but they're complaining about other people not doing. I don't know if anybody's pointed that out to them, but just.
I'm not sure their egos would allow them to see that.
That's just interesting.
If I could just come back in. But, you know, that's what happens. That is what's happened. That is what's happening. But there's also really a grassroots movement of younger physicians now, and they're really coming out of family medicine. It's that family medicine group that's very different in their approaches, and they are very open to education. So they educate as part of their model. In their service delivery, they do patient education. And I think that going to some of those groups and talking with them, we might have a little bit more of an open ear. And then there's the group that's coming in now that's doing the whole integrative medicine approach. And we're talking really about thousands of physicians across the country that are part of this movement right now. And again, I stay in touch with it just because I stay in touch with the integrative medicine movement, and also because my son, as he's training and going to conferences, he just came back from a meeting up in Cleveland last weekend and was just on fire because he said, oh my gosh, he said, in family medicine is where integrative medicine is happening. And so again, just as we are resistant to change as psychologists, and I will always remember that talk from Sandy Schulman that I heard way, way back as an early psychologist. And she said, you have to get out of your box. You can't just do psychology in the box anymore. And I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, Sandy, if you said box or room, but that struck me that day that I heard that. And it was an address you gave to the early career dinner. And, you know, we have to, of course, work within our scope, but also work with how we can marry what we do with what other groups are doing that are beginning to move down this road. And, you know, when we talk about, whether we talk about gun violence or whatever it is we're talking about, particularly at this level of violence in our country right now, we have to work cooperatively with other professionals.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think I've been sitting here thinking in the discussion earlier, when we talked about the more elderly folks in the church in the Black communities, I kept wondering whether people are looking at us and saying, we don't want to go to that church either, that we're more like the church-focused screening plan rather than to go out in the community and really be where the next wave of issues are.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder, I'm going to throw this out this as I'm looking at the question about culture influencing our interventions. I think when we wrote that question, I know we were talking about like culture, like, you know, Caucasian culture or African-American culture, but I'm just thinking about the culture of psychology. Rosemary, mostly from your question about like this one-on-one in the room, private, and how the culture of reimbursement and traditional models is really kind of, it seems like limiting this conversation we're having about how do we help people with gun violence. Because when it comes right down to it, at the end of the day, we want to go to communities, we want to help people, but we're not getting paid to do it. You know, Medicare is not going to reimburse me to go and do how do you cope after a violent event in a nursing facility, right? So I think that's another cultural issue to address is how the psychology culture kind of traps us in there. And I know, Sandy, that's what you're talking about too, but I just don't know how to get away from, we want to do this is the right thing. It is a public health issue, like you said, Elizabeth, but we also, at the end of the day, I still have to put food on my family's table. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mary, I agree with you. And that's where, you know, all of us, like you said, we get paid fee per service. And if I'm not working within my scope and providing this evidence-based therapy to this one person, I'm not getting paid. That is the problem. And that's why we stay where we're at, because that binds us. And so, you know, I'm hoping that through communities and conversations like this, we can keep having that conversation, particularly when insurance is locking us down more and more. You know, going from that 60 minutes to that 45 minutes to make sure you have enough support for that extra 15 minutes that you might want to give. You know, it's more and more difficult. And I agree, it is that culture of psychology and now the culture called insurance that's governing us. indirectly.
Well, that's
or
what I
directly.
wanted to add. That's what I wanted to add is the whole notion of how's that fee for service working for you? I mean, that, you know, I think we have followed other people's models of how to get funded. And I'm not suggesting we all stop practicing the way we are at this point. But, you know, I really believe if there were intervention strategies that you could demonstrate make a difference, particularly if they were quicker or cheaper, the difference, the fact that they are different, you know, the payers for these services don't really give a patoot about the way we do our work. They really care about the results. And, you know, staying ethically within the general frame of what we're trying to do, there may be other approaches. You know, I'm always struck, for example, that we build so much of our work around the one-to-one and confidentiality as the leverage of all of that. And I'm guessing that in many of these communities where there are really difficult ongoing stressors all the time, whether it's gun violence, which is our focus now, or many other forms of stress, I suspect in those communities, confidentiality is probably not the biggest issue that drives them or would drive them for services. So.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that too. I'm not fee for service. I work at a college counseling center, which means I am funded to do community level interventions, but the ethics code is very difficult to interpret around these issues. I sort of walk out on a limb when I'm in a meeting with a bunch of folks who, some of whom are my clients. You know, I'm always managing multiple relationships as I do that community intervention while still maintaining some private therapy work with the same people that I'm out in the community with. So it's very challenging with our current ethics code, which is very individualistic, kind of white Western middle class model of therapy informing that. So that's definitely one of the challenges and barriers, I think, for these kinds of interventions we're talking about. So I should redirect us. It's actually already 11:30. This has been a great discussion so far, and I want us to make sure that we get to action steps. So I want us to spend about the next 15 minutes here talking about what are the action steps we'd like to see over the next year for OPA in terms of the board. What can the board and leadership do? And then what do we want to suggest our members do when this gets reported out? What do we hope folks will take and act on after this discussion?
Kathy, I'll go ahead and start. I think one of the things that we've kind of already been doing, and what certainly I think after this discussion and our town hall today, is how do we continue to, and this is with the committee that I'm over, the diversity committee, is how do we continue to work towards, again, identifying, I think, the issues that we think are salient issues that we want to address as it relates to one of our goals, and that's to continue to provide education and just increase awareness around issues of diversity. And certainly, I think this has a major piece in the work that we can do, again, possibly a webinar or training or some next step. And I know that's one of the areas we've been working on, is just, again, identifying issues, who would possibly take the lead on it, where are the areas of expertise that would self-inform that and be a part of that training. So I think that's one thing. And another one, and I just mentioned from legislative day, one of the things that we've been doing is just continued ongoing discussion and dialogue with our legislators at a local level. And so one of the things that I've been doing as the VP has been meeting with some of the legislators. For example, the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus, Stephanie House, I've been meeting with her on a regular monthly basis. And again, one of the things is just identifying where some of their focus lie on, and then in terms of where some of our focus lie on, and where we can possibly intersect there to help to support what we're doing as psychologists, but also increase our value so that they understand how we again can impact the work that they're trying to do. We both collaborate in some way there. So that's something I would like to see us continue to do and even strengthen from a committee perspective.
That second one of meeting with local legislators, if we could give people a cheat sheet or handout on how to do that, that might be something we could ask our members to do as well.
And I know that's something the advocacy committee is always trying to support and push for. So any help we can give them, I think they would appreciate.
Yeah, we've over the years worked very hard to try to really have a network of people who are closely connected with their state senators and state reps. And we have a few connections, but we really don't have a complete network. So there are lots of areas in the state where our relationship with their legislators is pretty weak. And it would be helpful if members went out more and had coffee with their legislators. I mean, you're on a Thanksgiving break now for a couple of weeks. This would be a great time to do it. It's probably too late to get our members motivated to do anything like that, but they take a lot of breaks. And they're home over the weekend. So there are plenty of opportunities to see them back in the district, either in town hall meetings or just say, let's get together and have coffee. And, I want to talk to you about some of the issues I see as a psychologist. And I'm sure they would be more than willing to do that.
And Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I've seen in the past, we do have resources, handouts as far as, how you might write a letter to your legislator, how you might make the phone call. And that those can be applied to a diversity of topics that we would like to advocate for or against.
Absolutely. We provide a lot of that information during legislative day. We've been especially working hard to get graduate students and early career psychologists to attend legislative day because we want to be sure that they have that kind of information as they're going forward in their careers.
I just wanted to commend OPA for making these issues and concerns and efforts more apparent and transparent to those who aren't so familiar with what OPA does. One of the ways that I became more involved in OPA was through the convention sessions. For example, there was a session about LDA. I learned about it in that session, and that's how I became involved with it. I think that, and there are several other sessions that made it more possible for me to understand what OPA is all about. I think that putting these issues in that type of forum is a wonderful idea in terms of getting the attention of more diverse providers and early career psychologists, and making it known that our perspectives are needed. So, like Gary said, I think that we need to do a lot of, more of the same, making sure that psychologists that are OPA members and psychologists that aren't OPA members understand what the goals of OPA are so that they can become involved if they're interested. And some people may not even know that some of their interests intersect with what OPA interests are. And I think that the convention does a wonderful job of that.
I jotted down a few areas from our conversation over the last 2 hours, almost 2 hours, where I thought there were some opportunities for us maybe to take some action. One would be to prepare an op-ed on how these kinds of violent events are described and talk about the language and try to inform people about the impact of the choices we make about how we identify and describe these kinds of events. That's something we could certainly do. more training and information on alternative practice models seemed to be something that people were saying would be really helpful to try to help psychologists understand that there's not just the one-on-one model that is available to them, that there are other models that are being very effective and are important these days. We could do a series of trainings on trauma-informed therapy. That seemed to be one of the messages from earlier in the conversation. Information or training on how to engage communities, particularly communities of color. Cultural competency training for other professions. We certainly have the knowledge and skills to put together some impactful workshops and even webinars on cultural competence we could make available to physicians and nurses and podiatrists and whatever. And Gary was talking about mentoring in communities, and I'm not sure a lot of us really know how to do mentoring effectively. So maybe just some information or even a webinar on mentoring and encouraging psychologists in their communities and in the communities where their clients live to get involved in doing some mentoring. Might be a way to get our members maybe out there more in communities.
Thank you,
morning,
Michael.
everyone. This is Jessica. I jumped in really late. I had a no-show. So hi.
Hi.
Hi. Michael, yes,
Hey.
I agree with what you said about the mentoring. And I was thinking about that also in terms of extending relationships and building rapport. So we're so focused on legislators, but what about our local leaders? So city council, school board, educators, other people that are leaders within the local, even smaller micro level, because there is that need for that. And so when I've been at community events and people have said, oh, we could definitely talk about this and figure out a way to engage, and people are interested in what we do and what ways we can mentor and build relationships with the community, I think that would help to think outside of the box also and how we cultivate relationships more locally.
That's very important. Really good point, Jessica. And I'm sorry that Eric Merkel wasn't with us today, because I think he would have had some message for us about how we can have an impact on schools. And you're mentioning school boards made me think of that. A lot of what we're talking about is probably addressed in the schools, or should be, and our school psychologist colleagues are really on the direct line for that. So maybe working more closely with them to help them in doing what they do with children is important too.
I just want to say we had, I've been live tweeting our assembly, and I actually just got a response from a psychologist. I don't know if he's in Ohio, but Dr. Adams said some thoughts on some of the questions I posed online were come into communities of color if invited by people of color. So that maybe this idea that we want to rush in and do that isn't the right choice. But the second response he said was, your work as a white psychologist is most needed in your own community. And I think that's a really profound question for us to address and think about. And then his last thought was drop the idea of being an ally and replace it with the term anti-racist antagonist, which is a term that comes from Dr. Helm's work. I've heard allyship behavior being replaced with ally, because the idea of an ally means you suddenly get a badge and you're there. But those are those language issues, I think, to talk about, is even when we talk about words like ally, that might not be the right term to use. So I just wanted to share that, because that was
interesting thought.
Yeah, those are some responses I'm getting from different people online.
These are great.
A lot of work to do in the white community, to be sure.
We do.
Yeah, one of the things the words that keep coming to mind the last hour are cultural humility. We talk a lot about cultural competence because we like the idea that we can become competent in something. But ultimately, I think what we're understanding now is that we never will be fully competent culturally and need to take an attitude of humility and begin to understand that we have to approach this as lifelong learning, where there's a lot of self-examination involved, uncovering our own biases. So I agree that, again, we've been talking about, as white psychologists, how do we help communities of color, is a really great point that we may need to look at how do we become anti-racist therapists and psychologists. Maybe we need discussion about that among folks with privilege.
Maybe that's our spring conference topic.
That's a good question.
Well, and the overall theme is inclusive in this spring conference, so perfect.
Yeah.
Any final action steps that we haven't mentioned that folks would like to see reported out?
I'm curious about if there are any aspects of APA who are looking into research, policy changes about the ability to do research that we could support or work with or something.
I think I saw a statement from Tony Puente, the APA president, about the research question. I guess he put it out in his capacity as president, but I don't know that APA is doing much about it at this point.
Michael, I think it would be fair to say any of those statements that Tony's putting out are coming out of some part of our government relations work, and that was probably out of the public interest government relations office that statement comes out. So that would be the best first place to check would be, I think, in public interest, in one of the government relations folks there, to find out exactly what our efforts are. There is some ongoing work, and they would have that information. I know they would.
Can I add one thing to your list too, Michael? With the language piece, I think there's the language piece that Elizabeth talked about in terms of how we refer to gun violence that's done by different groups. Mm-hmm. But I would love to see OPA specifically address this idea of when a white person commits a shooting, the assumption is they're mentally ill. And this idea of tying mental illness with gun violence and disengaging that. And I know NAMI's done some work on that, and there was a lovely Huffington Post article, but I think just within Ohio, I'd like OPA to have a stance where we say, gun violence and mental illness are not 100% equivocal, and just talk about what we know and what we don't know. I don't know, Elizabeth, I'm looking at the Committee on Social Responsibility possibly as the home for that project because it is more of a social outreach thing, but I don't want to put too much on your plate. But just some thinking about how that might fit in with that committee's work.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we can talk about in the future on like how we can address things in that regard.
Okay.
But I agree that it's probably a good home for a topic like that.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. So I'd love to spend the last 10 minutes getting some closure and also thinking forward. With the new governance model, we'll have an in-person assembly every spring at convention. So if you're coming the end of April to Columbus for convention, that assembly will be Thursday morning and Friday morning from 8 to 9 with bagels and coffee. So I encourage you to join us for that. We'll be asking for topics toward the end of February, so watch for that, and please submit your ideas. And then we'll do this virtual format again every fall. So this was our first time. It was very interesting. I'm at home. This is my bed backboard you're seeing here. I don't have a home office that looks neat, so this is the best I can do.
Get out of your jammies now.
I know, right? And apparently my 19-year-old cat threw up on the carpet during this call, and my husband was vacuuming away very loudly. So I had to go yell at him and he
Oh my goodness.
informed me of the situation, so I apologize for having to leave. So that's one of the challenges, I guess, of these virtual meetings. But I want to hear from you all. First, what was most engaging, helpful, fun about this? And then we'll look at what can we do better for next fall. So what did you enjoy? What was interesting for you?
Catherine, can you repeat the dates of the spring meeting?
Yeah, Michael, can you give me the exact dates, that Thursday and Friday morning of convention?
I can in a minute. Maybe,
Okay.
maybe Karen will jump in before I find it.
It's April 26th, 27th, it's a Thursday and Friday, from 8 to 9.
Great. April 26th and 27, 8 to 9.
Thank you.
Thursday and Friday. Yeah, great.
And
So what was fun?
I want to just raise Jen's last comment. I'm sorry, it popped up while I wasn't looking. Jen said, our children's librarian approached me not too long ago about there being a great need in our community for a program like this. And a lot of people have talked to her about it, just wasn't sure where to start. So that's another place. We used to do public education campaign things at local libraries. That was one of APA's pushes before they shifted their focus to the YMCA's. So that is something maybe once our PEC gets back up and going, we can, Jen, we can give you some information about how do you go to a library and do that, and some materials related to that. So thank you for that question and that comment.
I'm just really pleased with the diversity of people who've signed up, and I'm not disappointed at the number. I think we had a good conversation with a reasonably sized group, and really appreciate everybody's participation.
I also have a real appreciation for this format because I feel like, I know for myself, it really isn't feasible to pop down to Columbus, you know, all of these extra times of the year. And I imagine I'm not alone in that. And so I think that the more we can make these opportunities as easy to access as possible, the greater diversity of people will be able to participate. And especially as we can go forward and continue to improve and spread the word that this is what we're doing, I think there's a really great potential for this to be quite successful.
We can accommodate up to 50 people in this format, which I think is a lot of people.
Yeah.
I think this topic is certainly important enough to maybe even come back to possibly do a part 2 and maybe even broaden it out some. I really enjoyed today learning a lot of new things and just hearing the various comments. And for me, just going back to say, okay, well, what areas do I need to myself just improve on and just go back and then do a little bit more work. So it's very helpful for me.
How will the action items and some of the topics or points brought up be publicized?
Yeah, Karen Hardin has some fantastic ideas about just showing clips of or recordings of this assembly. I could also see this becoming an article in the e-newsletter. We can look at different ways to publicize it out. I also think, Mary, I might ask that this be an agenda item for our next board meeting, that we look at the action items for the board and then have those discussed for, you know, which committee might take this on as a project. So those are some of the ways. If you have other thoughts or ideas, definitely we're open to that.
Some of these things might be of interest to the regional associations too, because there are a few of these things that they could do fairly easily as well.
Great. So what are some ideas for next fall as we do this the second time with the virtual assembly? what are some things that could make the experience even better for folks next year?
I'm wondering if, I know there can only be 50 participants, but is it possible for maybe like regional groups to congregate in a conference room somewhere and maybe not be involved vocally, because that might be unwieldy, but be a part by observing and participating that way, and maybe emailing questions or I don't know, something to bring a larger group into the discussion and create enthusiasm.
Yeah, I think our key there is to start early. So that's a fantastic thought. We kind of wanted to do that this year, but it was just too fast for us to get it coordinated in time. But similar to how you can see Michael Ranney up there, there's a conference room. Well, we could have regional associations or just folks in different centers in conference rooms like that participating, but together.
I'm also tempted to suggest, for example, on today's topic, we probably could have identified somebody at APA, not in the practice directorate, probably in public interest, that could have joined the Zoom conference and been a resource person for the conference, not a speaker necessarily, but a resource person. I really am concerned that a lot of state associations only relate to APA through a practice directorate. And I think the issues we're talking about, there's just tremendous resources elsewhere in APA about a number of these issues that we probably could benefit from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as a state association director, it's really irritating many times that information we want isn't available in the practice directorate, and it's really hard to get it. They don't like us interacting with the other directorates.
Well, I think you should disregard that preference and go directly to the directorates, Michael. I can tell you that right now. I really, and I'll help you do it. That's not even a question. That's going to change. I can feel it changing already. Good. And that's exactly, we could be some of the early front runners and then piloting some things that are very successful. I think if you get some other parts of APA engaged with the state associations, you're going to get they'll be coming back to you all the time. And I think we could be one of the front runners on that.
There's an issue on our listserv now about the GOP tax plan and how it impacts graduate students and students in general. And the practice directorate isn't really weighing in on that at all at this point.
No, because you probably need to talk to somebody in the education directorate about it.
Right. Yeah.
And you know.
Well, and since we have this recorded, can we make it available to somebody in these other directorates afterwards so that they are hearing what we're talking about? And
yeah, we can for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. While we're talking about APA, this might be a good time for me to let folks know that Sandy Schulman, who's been on this call and who's a past president of OPA and has served on the APA board of directors multiple times, is going to be running for APA president-elect. So, yay, Sandy.
Hey. Yay, that's exciting.
Very exciting. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. You'll be hearing more about it. The first and only thing you have to think about now is sometime next spring, there'll be this thing that comes out that says you want to nominate somebody. Would appreciate that. But you'll hear a lot more about it after that. So thanks a lot, Catherine. I appreciate that.
Yes. One of the things I like about this call is that we've had folks from all levels. So we have the input from the Public Interest Directorate and other trauma-related associations that are national. We've been talking about APA and how to help them, support them, and get resources from them. And then we're also, a lot of OPA leadership is here, and also some of our general membership, including students, are here. So I love the range that's been present and participating on this assembly. I've been really appreciative of that.
Spread the word for the April assembly and then the assembly next fall. let people know this was valuable if you think it was.
Thank you all so much.
Rosemary here. Just a quick little comment. You know, when we were talking about the regional meeting, but maybe even the OPAG folks having a meeting at their school, like one of their, you know, governance meetings, they could actually schedule at the same time that we do the meeting, so that they could have their group as well.
That's a great idea. I like that, Rosemary.
I love that. Well, any any final thoughts before we go off the call today? Any final words for us?
Real quick, I wanted to thank you, Catherine, and Michael and Mary. I think even though everything is new this year, and even though we didn't have a lot of time, I really want to commend you on, I think, a job very, very well done and organizing this, organizing the agenda, the discussion questions, really leaving enough time for us to have meaningful discussion. As you would say, Catherine, it truly was a very rich discussion. And I'm very appreciative of all you have done and what lies ahead from us as we can. I'm hoping, Michael, that we might be able to post online or on our website some of the handouts that were to us. And maybe also if we could, you know, post this, the actual assembly call, and also perhaps the SAMHSA guidelines and models that you discussed, Mary. All of those might be helpful resources for us to make sure we post online, or links to them.
That's a great idea, Peg. Yeah. And I just want to close out by saying, you know, my gratitude for Catherine for pulling this together and being willing to guide us and lead us today. I think you're just such a wonderful leader for us in these, and to do a virtual group like this is really challenging. So I appreciate everyone's patience with the technology things. And just thanks to Michael and Karen for being here as staff today. And just a huge amount of gratitude again for all of you who are willing to give up a Saturday morning for a couple hours and come and talk to us about a not pleasant topic, but I feel really inspired, and just so much gratitude for your willingness. And hopefully, again, as Michael said, spread the word, you know, talk to us, keep this dialogue flowing. And as we share that information, maybe this is something we can extend. There's a discussion board on the website. We can talk, and then we'll dialogue again in the spring. So.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and watch for this to come out and be advertised and action steps for us as individuals. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Saturday.
Great job.
Great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Stop the recording. Stop the recording.
Yeah, I think just push this.